In New York in this weekend for Ana Cabrera. Well, Washington is embarking on a brand new week. Republicans are preparing to tackle the budget, tax reform, maybe even health care. So one might wonder why President Trump is adding fuel to his feud with a Florida congresswoman who accused the president of disrespecting the family of one of the soldiers killed in the Niger ambush. Well, the president tweeting this morning, wacky Congresswoman Wilson is the gift that keeps on giving for the Republican Party, a disaster for Dems. You watch her in action and vote R. Now, the Congresswoman, meanwhile, firing right back.
This is going to be this administration's Benghazi. This is going to be Trump's Benghazi, Trump's Niger.
So as the president and Congresswoman continue to exchange words, Barbs, one thing we still don't have answers to, the answers we want, as to why these Americans, these 4 Americans, why they were killed and why the body of one of them, Sergeant LaDavid Johnson, wasn't recovered for 48 hours. Of course, he was found a mile away, as we have reported. I want to get straight to CNN's Boris Sanchez live right outside the White House. And Boris, Republicans have a lot on their plates this week. There's still unanswered questions, though, about this Niger attack. What reason does the president have to keep this feud going?
Well, this is really just who President Trump is, right? We've never known Donald Trump to back down from a fight, whether with Democrats, Republicans, or even other Gold Star families. You recall the feud that he had with the Khan family after their appearance at the Democratic National Convention last year, where they went after President Trump. That did not leave the news cycle for quite some time. And really, with the comments from Representative Wilson today comparing the situation in Niger to Donald Trump's Benghazi, it is likely this fight is not going away anytime soon either. The White House has not commented on these latest exchanges between the South Florida Congresswoman and the president, though the president was on Fox News earlier today talking about his combative style and why it's one that he favors. Listen.
Even your supporters say, you know, he's got fantastic policies. We want to see this through, but the bickering and the feuding actually gets in the way. So obviously the feuding with Senator Corker, I think there's a personal thing going on between you and Senator McCain. Do you worry that this bickering and feuding gets in the way of your agenda?
No, and sometimes it helps, to be honest with you. So we'll see what happens in the end. But I think actually sometimes it helps. Sometimes it gets people to do what they're supposed to be doing.
A bit of a side note now, Pamela. Congresswoman Wilson actually is now demanding an apology from Chief of Staff John Kelly after he compared her to an empty barrel and mischaracterized some statements that she made during a speech to law enforcement several years ago. Earlier today, the Congressional Black Caucus came out in defense of Representative Wilson, saying that they were appalled by Kelly's statements. This is a sensitive issue for the Chief of Staff. Of course, his son was killed in action in Afghanistan. He is a Gold Star parent himself. He has not yet commented, though, on Representative Wilson's latest comments or her being backed up by the Congressional Black Caucus. Pamela.
We'll have to wait and see what happens. Meantime, there was this phone call that took place today between the president and GOP lawmakers. What can you tell us about that?
Yeah, it took place this afternoon. A Republican source that was briefed on that phone call told me that House Speaker Paul Ryan made it clear to members of the Republican House contingent that he wants the Senate's budget with some House modifications passed this week because that would give them the best shot to pass tax reform before the end of 2017. I'm told that President Trump, along with Vice President Pence, were on that call. The president reiterating that idea, saying, quote, "We are on the verge of doing something very, very historic." The White House is putting a full court press on right now to get tax reform done. The president actually had an op-ed in today's copy of the USA Today saying it was time to reignite what he called the middle-class miracle. He's also set to meet with Republican senators on Tuesday at Capitol Hill, and that is likely to be an interesting exchange. As you know, Pamela, he has feuded with several Republican senators, including John McCain, Jeff Flake, and Bob Corker, so their interactions will likely be watched closely.
That's certainly right. Mook, I should say, and Scott Jennings. Robbie is a Hillary Clinton's former campaign manager. Scott is a former special assistant to President George W. Bush. Thank you both for coming on, gentlemen.
Thanks.
Thank you.
So, Scott, I'm going to start with you. Should Republicans who wanted answers about Benghazi be just as intent on getting answers about Niger?
Sure, I think we should get answers about what happened, but I think we need to do so under the framework of understanding that we have a lot of personnel in Africa. It's clear that the fight against ISIS, Al-Qaeda, and other terrorist elements is moving into the continent of Africa, probably more than we know right now. I think there's a lot of sensitive national security issues at play. And one of the things Donald Trump talked about during his campaign was not telegraphing to the enemy what we're doing and where we're doing it. So I think as we seek answers here, we have to be careful that we're not exposing our personnel in Africa to harm's way.
Do you think that's fair, Robbie?
Well, first of all, I think we'd both agree our condolences go out to these families for their loss. And I think it's unfortunate how politicized this issue has become. You know, honestly, I don't like comparisons to the Benghazi hearing because I don't think we learned anything out of it. I think it was a politicization of loss. And so, yes, we need to investigate, but not what happened with Benghazi.
So let me just ask you this, though, Robbie. You know, you were on the Clinton campaign. You managed the Clinton campaign. You're well aware that there are some Americans who hold Clinton personally responsible for Benghazi. I imagine you disagree with them in doing so. But is it unfair then to call the Niger ambush Trump's Benghazi? Do you think that's just too premature?
Well, I don't think we know enough to make any pronouncements about this. Like I said, I think this needs to be looked into, but it shouldn't be politicized. And I don't want to see the death of Americans in combat turned into some sensationalized partisan fight. If something happened here that was wrong, we need to find that out. I'm glad that Congressman Chaffetz is calling for this. I think there are other things that needed to be investigated as they pertain to the current Republican administration. I wish he'd speak out on those matters as well. But let's handle this the right way. Let's give the respect that's due to these families, and then find out if anything could have been done differently so that this doesn't happen again, if it was preventable.
So, Scott, to Robbie's point, you know, the bottom line is 4 U.S. service members died. That's what matters. Do you think both sides should cut it out, the White House, Congressman Wilson, this back and forth, and just focus on these 4 service members and what happened in Niger?
Yeah, I don't like the politics of this. These families are grieving, and we're having a political debate going on several days now about who said what to who and how it was said and how it was taken. I don't think this serves the families well at all. I don't think the White House gains anything from it. And frankly, I don't think the Democratic Party or Congresswoman Wilson gains anything by coming out today and saying, oh, this is Trump's Benghazi. I just think she doesn't know enough to make that pronouncement. And if she does make that pronouncement, is she admitting that Benghazi was the failure that Republicans said it was? This analogy breaks down on a number of fronts. And it also just breaks down the discourse around the concept here that we have a nation grieving for the loss of 4 soldiers. That's all anybody really ought to care about. We'll get to the facts in due time. But I just think this back and forth, as Robbie said, the politicization of it is frankly pretty disgusting.
And
right,
Pamela,
go ahead. Yep.
I think the one thing that could put an end to this back and forth is the president just needs to apologize. You know,
that won't happen, Robbie. You know that very well.
He's gotten a lot of people roped
He's never
into
been
this.
one to. He's never been one to apologize. Am I right, Scott?
Well, I think he thinks he's in the right most of the time, as most presidents do, and I think Congresswoman Wilson thinks she's in the right, so I don't expect either of them to apologize. I expect them both to keep arguing, and I expect to be disgusted by it every day this goes on. So
all right,
I think Robbie and I agree on that.
You do agree. Let's talk about something else that perhaps there may be some disagreement on. We'll have to see. Robbie, former President Jimmy Carter, a Democrat, as you well know, gave an interview to the New York Times. And in it, he says, quote, "I think the media have been harder on Trump than any other president, certainly that I've known about." Do you agree?
Well, I think the question is the media appropriately scrutinizing Donald Trump? And I think there is so much to scrutinize. I find the media often has trouble trying to prioritize what deserves a spotlight. In fact, I would argue the president and what's happened with these Gold Star families is a perfect example. He does so many objectionable, offensive things that it's hard to actually hold him accountable on the policy matters that affect people's lives. So I think that's the wrong question to be asking. I think are we scrutinizing Trump enough? And I think sometimes we're running into problems because there's so much. So I guess in that regard, I do disagree. I don't think anybody should be quote unquote lenient on this president. I think he has a lot to be held accountable for, and his behavior this week is another example of just how outrageous his behavior has been.
Well, he also revealed, Robbie, that he voted for Bernie Sanders, not Hillary Clinton, in the primaries. Are you surprised by that?
You know, I voted for Bernie Sanders when I was growing up in Vermont. I was proud to do so. You know, we had a spirited primary. I'm just glad that he participated and voted. You know, we were proud on Clinton's campaign to win by millions of votes.
Okay. All right, Robbie. Scott, to you. Last word to you. Do you think the media has been harder on Trump because, you know, some could argue that we've lowered the bar? What do you think?
I think the media has been incredibly difficult on President Trump, and I think we're also living in a media environment where everybody's trying to be first, but sometimes at the expense of being accurate. And we've seen a number of things in this administration reported and then pulled back. But the thing that everybody remembers is what was reported. This happens on Twitter all the time. And so I think that has caused trust in the media to go down. You can look at the Pew study that came out recently about Americans' trust in the media. And frankly, it worries me because we need a news media industry in this country that is trusted by people in both parties. And right now, a lot of Republicans don't trust it. And frankly, a lot of Democrats, as we heard from President Carter, don't trust it either. We need the media to be trusted because it's a critical part of what makes our democracy work.
So then do you think that trust in the White House should go down? Because just this past week, there were several examples of untruths. The president saying that he called virtually every family of service members who were killed after he took office. General Kelly coming out, giving a mischaracterization of Congresswoman Wilson. Do you think that the White House should be held to the same standard then?
Yeah, I do, actually. I think the White House, whenever it speaks, whether it's the president or a staffer, should always strive to tell the truth and give the best information they can. And look, we've seen in public polling,
and by the way, it's the media that holds
low.
them accountable to make sure the truths come out.
Yeah, look, I think that people who have the responsibility to govern the country and the responsibility of being on the public airwaves like we are right now have a responsibility to tell the truth. And if you go on television or walk out on the South Lawn or to the podium and you knowingly tell a falsehood, that's wrong. And so I don't think people are knowingly trying to do that every day, but when it does happen, we should acknowledge it, because I think acknowledging it and owning it when we don't tell the truth or when we give out things that aren't facts would actually increase public trust in all these institutions.
All right, Robbie, Scott, great discussion with both of you. Thanks.
Thanks.
Thanks, Pamela.
And just ahead this hour, we have a new report saying President Trump plans to spend hundreds of thousands of dollars to help staff and aides cover legal costs related to the Russia investigation. Here what the former director of the U.S. Office of Government Ethics is saying. Plus, the EPA says a chemical coming from a Louisiana factory is putting nearby residents at the highest risk in the country of developing cancer from air toxins.
You gotta live here to try and breathe the air. Drink the water. See the children so sick. Watch your people die. If you don't live in the area, you can say anything. And everybody's supposed to believe that.
A CNN investigation looks at how local people are fighting for relief. You are live in the CNN newsroom. I'll be back. Well, President Trump says he will dig into his own pockets to help people close to him pay their legal bills, people who are being investigated in connection to Russia's alleged meddling in last year's election, or perhaps just witnesses in that investigation. The amount, close to $500,000 of his own money. The payback plan and the amount both come from the White House, according to the Washington Post, who got those details firsthand. CNN contributor and Washington Post reporter David Fahrenthold is here with me now. David, great to see you. This story, obviously right up your alley. You won the Pulitzer Prize this year for investigating candidate Donald Trump's claims of charitable donations. So $430,000 the president pledges he'll pay these legal fees for his aides and campaign officials. What do you think is going to happen in your research from your research and experience?
Well, what I found last year looking at Trump's charitable giving, and we've seen it in other parts of his life as well, is he exploits often the belief people have that if someone's going to pledge something in public, pledge to spend some money in public, people believe, well, he must be about to fulfill that. Obviously, if he wouldn't say it in public if he wasn't going to do it. What I found in my research on Trump's charitable giving was that often he would promise something and then never deliver, but sort of go around with people believing that he'd done this thing he promised. In this case, he's pledged the money, but why not just give the money? These legal bills already exist. Right now, he's not even paying his own legal bills. The RNC is paying for them. So it seems like if he really wants to do this, if I was somebody who was thinking about relying on President Trump to pay for my legal bills, I would say, well, show me the money. Don't pledge it. Give it to me.
Well, there may be perhaps one reason why it hasn't happened yet, because of a potential conflict of interest. I want to read you this tweet from Walter Schaub, the former director of the Office of Government Ethics, and his reaction to this, President Payne promising to pay his staff's legal fees. This is what he says. He says, let's see, a potential witness or target of an investigation and boss of investigators paying for legal fees of other potential witnesses or targets. Question, how about that? Some people are seeing an ethical conflict with the president footing legal bills for people in a still active investigation. So, of course, he is raising the question here of if the president's paying their legal bills, will that influence, will their interviews with Robert Mueller be tainted because they feel like the president's doing something nice for them?
Well, there's certainly that possibility. I mean, and that's another question. If Trump actually does follow through and pays for these folks' legal bills, you're right. There's a possibility that they'll say things. They won't spill the beans about him, or they'll sort of shade the truth in their interviews to help him because he's paying for them. That's certainly a possibility. There's a lot of other ways, though, that the president has power to offer these people favors or pardons, things like that. So you have to worry about conflicts of interest anyway, and I would certainly add this to the list if he goes ahead and does it. But let's not give him credit or blame for having done it until he actually does do it.
All right. I know you will be staying on top of that. Special counsel Robert Mueller, the former FBI director, is leading this investigation, as we well know, into the alleged Russian interference. The president says he has not been asked to be interviewed yet. Several key people who were once in the president's inner circle have been interviewed. Do you think this investigation will go forward without the president's input? And do you think that if he is asked, that the lawyers in the White House will allow him to be interviewed by Robert Mueller?
That's a great question. I don't imagine this investigation, since it seems to be so much focused on President Trump's life, both his conduct in office, his conduct last year during the election, and also possibly his conduct as the head of the Trump Organization over a number of years before the election. It seems difficult to me to imagine that could ever conclude without actually Mueller or his team talking directly to the president. I don't know when that will be, and I don't know if President Trump would consent to be interviewed. It certainly seems like that would be kind of the natural endpoint. You remember the interview or the investigation by the FBI of Hillary Clinton over her emails last year. One of the last things in that interview was a face-to-face interview that Hillary Clinton did with the FBI at her home. I don't imagine this will be that different.
You're right. There's these concentric circles, and it seems like they're moving closer and closer to the president. But I've spoken to people close to him who say actually they would advise against him doing an interview with Mueller. So we'll have to wait and see what happens here. David Fahrenthold, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Well, the morning after 5 former U.S. presidents joined forces to raise money to help storm victims, a senator calls on the current president to make a specific change to speed up help for Puerto Rico. Details on what he's calling for just ahead. You are live in the CNN newsroom. Well, more than a month after Hurricane Maria made landfall in Puerto Rico, power and a sense of normalcy are still slow to return for millions of American citizens in the U.S. territory. Take a look right here at the devastation in this new drone video we've obtained. Much of the Caribbean island still underwater. Only 20% of Puerto Rico has electricity at this point, while 73% of customers have water and sewage services. And about half of cell phone towers are operational today. Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer called on President Trump to create a position to deploy federal resources to Puerto Rico.
So today, the three of us are calling on the White House, are calling on the president to appoint an experienced CEO of response and recovery for Puerto Rico. The CEO would directly report to the president. He or she would have the ability to coordinate all the federal government and link it up to the governor of Puerto Rico and other elected people of Puerto Rico so that they can tell them what they need and get it done.
CNN's Polo Sandoval joins me live from San Juan. And Polo, what are the people of Puerto Rico saying about the pace of recovery there?
Well, you know, Pamela, yesterday we told you about the struggle to reopen schools. come next week, in just a few days. Today, though, we checked in on efforts to try to avoid a looming health threat. We're talking debris. We checked in with a community just west of San Juan, Puerto Rico today, spent the day there with people as they finally saw crews making their way into their neighborhood to clear out these piles of soaked belongings that have been littering the sidewalk now for close to 5 weeks. The concern here is you have debris. Debris often leads to mosquitoes and rodents. Mosquitoes and rodents then lead to disease. And in an island that is in the middle of this crisis that is still trying to recover, that certainly could deliver a devastating blow. So that is why people today were overcome with a sense of relief to see some of this heavy equipment finally make their way through their streets. Scooping out all this garbage. And there was method to this. We noticed that there were some contractors that have been hired by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers to essentially pluck out the garbage from the garbage. We're talking the potentially toxic materials, paint, certain electronics, refrigerators. Those had to stay behind so the Environmental Protection Agency can then come in and dispose of that appropriately. As for the rest of it, that's all going to landfills, which is leading to another concern. This island, according to the EPA, produces about 8,500 tons of garbage a day. That's before Maria. So all of this debris is now going to be going to these landfills that officials say are already to their capacity. So the question tonight, Pamela, what will happen to all this furniture, these electronics, lumber, and of course other organic material that's getting scooped up off the streets?
We'll have to wait and see. Polo Sandoval, thank you for your reporting there on the ground in Puerto Rico. It was an extraordinary sight. 5 former U.S. presidents sharing the stage at a benefit concert last night, all to raise money for hurricane relief. Presidents Barack Obama, George W. Bush, George H.W. Bush, Bill Clinton, and Jimmy Carter hosted the televised event from Texas A&M University. It was billed as the One America Appeal, and Americans responded in a huge way, pledging about $2 million in hurricane relief to victims in Texas, Florida, and Puerto Rico. And artists like Lee Greenwood, Lyle Lovett, Lady Gaga even performed. Let's take a listen.
You say you're not from Texas, man, as if I couldn't tell. You think you throw your boots on right and wear your hat.
And President Donald Trump also participated in the One America Appeal fundraiser through a taped video message. Straight ahead on this Sunday, the EPA says more than 20,000 people in Louisiana have the highest risk in the country of developing cancer from toxic chemicals in the air. But state regulators say the threat isn't imminent.
Husband and wife died from cancer across the street. Husband over here died from cancer. Both of his sons got cancer. Where all this cancer coming from?
The desperate calls for cleaner air. A CNN investigation up next. Well, people in a small Louisiana community say that on some days it is literally sickening to be outside. The EPA says a local factory is releasing a chemical that's putting them at the highest risk in the country of developing cancer from air toxins. Well, state regulators say the threat isn't imminent, but local people say cases of cancer are common, they're afraid, and they're begging for help. Victor Blackwell has the CNN investigation.
The air is so foul, the water is so messed up, and so many people are ill and dying of cancer.
Geraldine Watkins is afraid. Her family has lived in St. John the Baptist Parish in Louisiana for almost 40 years. She loves the people, but recently she learned that she and more than 20,000 others who live nearby have the highest risk in the country of developing cancer from air toxins. The toxin in this case is chloroprene. According to data from the EPA's National Air Toxics Assessment, or NATA, the risk for people who live in this area, highlighted in red, ranges from roughly 5 to more than 20 times the national average.
I was outraged because I'm trying to figure out why people hadn't been informed of this earlier.
The source is this plant owned by Denka. The Japanese company bought it from DuPont in late 2015. The company makes a synthetic rubber found in wetsuits, electric insulations, and other common products. The plant has emitted chloroprene as part of the process for more than 40 years. We asked the EPA for an interview. They declined, but agreed to answer questions via email. The EPA tells us 99% of the chlorprene that's emitted by facilities across the country comes from this plant. In 2010, the EPA determined chlorprene is likely carcinogenic to humans, meaning studies show it likely causes cancer in humans. And the EPA says there are many other health problems associated with exposure to chlorprene.
I grew up with a chronic kidney disease all my life.
Robert Taylor III says he grew up near the plant and that he was in and out of hospitals for most of his childhood. He moved away after high school and had no problems for more than 20 years. Then, just 6 months after moving back, Taylor says his kidneys failed. And Taylor says cancer diagnoses are common in his neighborhood.
Husband and wife died from cancer across the street. Husband over here died from cancer. Both of his sons got cancer. Where all this cancer coming from? These people filling us up with this poison.
In the spring of 2016, the EPA installed 6 canisters in the neighborhood surrounding this plant. They're collecting air samples. They're tested every 3 days to find out just how much of this toxic chemical is in the air. And for more than a year now, the EPA has repeatedly found concentrations of chloroprene that are 10, 50, 100 times, and in one case more than 700 times the amount it says is at the upper limit of acceptability for cancer risk.
And for more than a year, the EPA's testing found average chloroprene concentrations that significantly exceeded that amount. At one site, more than 49 times the recommended amount.
They say it's 10 times or 20 times or some order of magnitude times higher than what a standard is. Well, there is no standard.
Chuck Carr Brown is Louisiana's Secretary of Environmental Quality. He's right about those spikes. The EPA has not set a legal limit for chloroprene emissions. It says it's a years-long process. But according to this May 2016 internal memo obtained by CNN, federal regulators have set a recommendation based on cancer risk. An annual average of 0.2 micrograms of chloroprene per cubic meter as what it calls the upper limit of acceptability. Just remember the number, 0.2. It's represented by the red line on this graph. Now, look at the average chloroprene concentration found in the air at those 6 testing sites between May 2016 and August 2017. One of those testing sites is here, near Fifth Ward Elementary School, just a few hundred yards from the plant. We found that the average concentration in the air near the school over 17 months was more than 34 times the EPA's cancer risk recommendation of what's acceptable.
That is just...
The state's top environmental regulator, who says part of his mission is to protect human health, also says this.
And again, I say 0.2 doesn't mean anything to me. I want to get to as close to 0 as I possibly can. To artificially target a number that you can't legally enforce, it absolutely makes no sense.
Jorge Lavastida is an executive officer of the company and the manager of the plant.
So this company doesn't believe that chloroprene causes cancer?
That is correct.
This summer, Denka asked the EPA for a correction. The company commissioned a study which argues that chloroprene's classification should be changed from likely carcinogenic to humans to possibly carcinogenic, and that 0.2 should be 31.2. More than 150 times the EPA's cancer risk recommendation.
We have looked at the study that they did with NATA and how they came up with that 0.2, and we have found gaps in the science of it.
The EPA stands by its findings. And despite its skepticism, the company promised the state to install control technologies at the plant to reduce chloroprene emissions.
That includes 4 projects that reduce our emissions by 85%. We're investing $20 million on those projects. There's going to be hundreds of thousands of dollars of operating expenses when those are in. Very aggressive schedule, and it's our #1 priority.
However, equipment that was supposed to have been installed by September is now slated for the end of the year. Secretary Brown says there's nothing to worry about.
Best available control technology is an acceptable protocol.
But why not start with the risk to the people? Why not start with that number
and
then build out from there?
That's exactly what I'm doing.
Every time I brought up the 0.2 number, you said it's not enforceable, it hasn't been promulgated, it's not a standard. You go back to the technology and the enforceable standard there from whatever the company installs.
That's how you
why not start what the risk is to the people?
We've got a protocol in place. That our data shows us there's no imminent threat.
You gotta live here to try and breathe the air, drink the water, see the children so sick, watch your people die. If you don't live in the area, you can say anything, and everybody's supposed to believe that. If they can't cut the emissions down, shut them down until they can repair them. Then bring the plant back up. I don't want anybody to lose their job, but we can no longer live in these emissions.
We're not just going to sit around and let them push us around. And
Taylor is part of a class action lawsuit to force the company to reduce the emissions to meet the EPA cancer risk recommendation. He's joined on behalf of his 10-year-old daughter, Navy Love. He says she developed asthma and needs to use an oxygen machine several times per week. He blames the emissions.
They don't have any compassion for human life. My little girl, 10 years old, she innocent.
You know,
and at 76 years old, Watkins hopes that federal regulators, state regulators, someone will force Denka to adhere to the cancer risk recommendation for her sake and for the sake of her family.
Let me live. Whatever time I have left, let it be decent. We need clean air. We need help to get this done.
So an important question here, are there more actual cases of cancer in those communities with the highest risk of developing cancer? Well, the state does not know, and here's why. Because cancer rates are measured at the parish level, not the smaller census tract level like the EPA toxin study. So right now, there is no way to know if just that part of the parish around the plant has a disproportionate amount of cancer cases. But that's going to change soon, because a new law in Louisiana requires the LSU Tumor Registry, which keeps track of cancer numbers, to publish cancer stats at the smaller census tract level. And then we'll be able to compare the EPA's estimated cancer risk to the actual number of cancer diagnoses. Pamela, back to you.
In the U.S., there are hundreds of private armed militias claiming thousands of members. And more recently, militias have been showing up at protests and counter-protests really around the country. They say it's because they want to keep the peace. And tonight's This Is Life, Lisa Ling embeds with a heavily armed militia deep in the Arizona desert, preparing for foreign and domestic threats.
Hey, Liz Silverback from Southern Arizona Militia. How you doing?
His militia is less than a year old, but already has more than 20 official members.
Well, our goal pretty much is being trained and prepared. You know, like the old saying is, you know, it's better to have it than not need it, and need it than not have it.
Not many militias are open to the media, but Silverback wants to correct what he says is a bad rap from the press. So he's invited our cameras to see operations from within.
Silverback.
Lisa.
Nice to meet you.
Thanks for coming in.
How often are you getting people inquiring and wanting to be part of your militia?
All the time. It's just continuous.
How often do you train?
Every weekend. Every weekend except for the major holidays, Christmas, Thanksgiving, those sort of things.
What exactly are you training for?
Name it. I mean, it could be anything. Civil unrest, economic collapse, a foreign government or American government threat. Anything that would endanger ourselves and the members in our groups and families. We don't cower in our homes afraid to leave because something bad's going to happen. In case something bad happens, we do all this training.
So interesting. Lisa Ling joins us now from Los Angeles. Lisa, great to see you. What was the impression, your impression of the militia members you met? How did they strike you?
Well, I was a little concerned before actually embedding with them. We went and spent time with them very shortly after the presidential election, and I asked them whether, because President Trump was the victor, whether they still felt the need to be as vigilant. And they said, absolutely. Our political system has nothing to do with how prepared we need to be. During President Obama's administration, the number of militias grew exponentially throughout the country. And as far as this particular militia is concerned, they don't really they don't care about which party is in power for them to feel the need to stay prepared.
And as they well know, which is part of the reason they brought you in, a lot of militias say they are painted in a bad light by the media. So after meeting with them, spending some time with them, seeing how they do what they do, did your impressions change at all?
Look, I'm very clear in the episode about how I have quite differing values and we have differences in opinions on many different issues, but we were actually able to find some common ground. As you know, militias are pretty defiant about protecting their Second Amendment rights. I, as a journalist, am defiant about protecting my First Amendment rights as well as my reproductive rights. And so, while again we have differing opinions on issues, we both are concerned about possible overreach of government, and I thought that was sort of interesting that at the end of the day we were able to sort of eke out that bit of common ground.
All right, Lisa Ling, thank you so much. And be sure to catch tonight's episode of This Is Life at 10 p.m. right here on CNN. And now, this week's Before the Bell, here's CNN's Zane Asher. Zane?
Hi, Pamela. It's all about corporate earnings this week on Wall Street. So far, with 15% of the S&P 500 companies reporting, 78% have actually beaten expectations. Those positive results helped drive the Dow above 23,000 for the first time ever. Stocks have been hitting milestones at a furious pace this year. This week, we'll also get a first look at third quarter economic growth as well. In the second quarter, gross domestic product hit 3.1%, the fastest rate in 2 years. It's a stat President Trump has certainly praised, even as he dials down expectations for the third quarter.
GDP growth has reached more than 3% last quarter, and other than the hurricanes would have done phenomenally this, and I think we'll still do very well, but something will have to be taken off because of the tremendous problems of the massive hurricanes that we've had to endure. And now I guess you could probably add the wildfires in California.
Economists are still finalizing their predictions, but we're likely to see a growth rate of between 2% and 3% in the third quarter. Then GDP could pick up in the final 3 months of the year as hurricane-hit communities rebuild. At the New York Stock Exchange, I'm Zane Asher.